Yeah, welcome in. Welcome back to another episode of the Format Podcast. A hurricane now downgraded in North Florida to Tropical Storm Ian episode of the Format Podcast. But in all seriousness, if you're in the path of this storm/hurricane, please be safe. Please be careful out there, all right? Best wishes to you and yours. Now, got a pretty good episode of the show today. Definitely going to talk about an interesting NBA topic that I've been listening to and thoughts that kind of tie into some things I've said previously. But before we get into all that, you know what you got to do. If you haven't already, please go ahead, click that subscribe, that like, and that notification bell on your screen to make sure that you're always notified and you're always in the loop when we put out new episodes. Definitely want to make sure that you keep continuing to get this content that I'm working hard to put out for you. Also, if you want the audio-only version of the podcast, we are available anywhere just about that you get your audio podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see some of those locations right here on the screen: Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, iTunes, whatever they call it, Stitcher, Spotify, Podbean, whatever it may be. Just type in the Format Podcast. You should be able to find us, all right? Go ahead, please leave us a comment, leave us a like. If you can, if your platform allows it, leave us that 5-star review. All those things help us move up in the algorithm so we can find more sports fans. More sports fans can find us. Finally, if you enjoy the show, please make sure you don't keep it to yourself. Give it to more sports fans. Share it with them so we can get it into more ears and we can keep doing this thing. All right. Okay. Now let's get to it. Recently, we know that within this last week, the NBA training camps have started to open back up, and we've been getting a lot of commentary from a lot of different players, execs, and all that. And probably the biggest story that's been dominating the NBA headlines, of course, is what's going on in Boston with Ime Udoka and him being suspended for the year and realistically likely not going to be returning as head coach to the Celtics. Now, I don't have any inside reporting on that, but just looking at the situation, looking at the reason he was suspended, obviously we know that it has to do with some affairs that he had that were allegedly consensual, blah, 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 but then may have turned into something different, which violated team rules because it was with another employee of the franchise. And so he was suspended for a year. And obviously in the Me Too climate, you're dealing with women in a situation that could get iffy and possibly have legal implications and ramifications. He's probably not going to be back. That's been the biggest story of the NBA training camp season so far. But we're actually not going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about something a little lighter. This is interesting because about 6 months ago on the JJ Redick podcast, he had Luka Doncic on, Dallas Mavericks star forward Luka Doncic. Well, forward, point guard, I guess jack of all trades, whatever you want to call him, positionless player, Luka Doncic. And he was on and he was talking about how much easier it is to score in the NBA. And if you're a basketball fan, you know that there's a big Eurobasket tournament, international tournament over in Europe this offseason. And we know that there's a lot more European players in the NBA now than there ever were before. And some of them are among the best players in the world. Like I mentioned, Luka. Also, of course, we have Giannis, who many people hold as the best player in the world currently, and two-time defending NBA MVP, Nikola Jokic. All those guys are European. All those guys went back home to play for their respective countries in the Eurobasket tournament. So anyway, what I find interesting was some of the commentary that's come out of that in training camp interviews this week. One of the things that was so interesting was that Giannis said that it is harder to play in Europe than it is to play in the NBA. Jokic said similar things, and as I mentioned before, Luka Doncic said months ago that it's much easier to score in today's NBA, in the NBA period. So let's check out the comments they made, and we'll come back and discuss those.
I only say scoring is easier in NBA just because of the amount of the different rules, the less space, the time. So that's why I said it.
So you think it's harder to score 30 points in a EuroLeague game than it is in an NBA game?
Yeah, 100%.
First of all, the game in Europe is way harder than the game in the NBA. And I don't want to disrespect the talent. Obviously, in the NBA, it's way higher. But the space is just, you have a lot of lanes to drive the ball, a lot of lanes to create. It's just, I think over there is more intense. Like people pick you up full court, double team you. full court zone, to man to the last 5 second double teams from the start from zone, and then they go man to man the last 10 seconds, and then the double team in the post. There's no lanes to drive. Like, it's just the more physical. Because I don't know if it's because the talent's less and you have to be, kind of be more physical to catch up with that. But like, it's harder. So I think always playing there prepares me for the season.
And is it harder? Yeah, just because I think you need to really think about it, and you need to have really quick thinking. Let's say like that. I think in NBA, if you go by the guy, you can see the help is coming. In Europe, is like if you go by the help is already there, so you need to kind of think, play ahead,
So I think this is first. You saw the title of this episode, and let's be real. The NBA should be ashamed of themselves. I totally agree with that title. That wasn't just a sensational headline that I made up to try and get some clicks. I mean, this is real. The NBA should be ashamed of itself because it's been known from the beginning as the best basketball league in the world, right? The best players are here. It's the best league overall. It gets the most attention, garners the most money. When you're a basketball player anywhere in the world and you're any good, what's your dream? To come play in the NBA, right? Okay, cool. Whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Europe, Africa, Asia, whatever. We've seen players, especially since the 1992 Dream Team, we've seen the world basically close the gap on the talent and skill level of American players and American basketball on the whole. But at the end of the day, the NBA is, that's where you come to test your mettle. And so I mentioned it earlier, you got maybe 3 of the top 10 players, maybe 3 of the top 8 players in the world. You got Giannis Antetokounmpo, the star of the Bucks, champion, former 2-time MVP, defensive player of the year, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to run it all down, but many people regard him as the best player in the world currently. You've got Luka Doncic, who a lot of people regard as a top 5 player in the world. You've got Nikola Jokic, point center for the Denver Nuggets, doing things that we haven't really seen a center do before in this game, or maybe not necessarily in this game, but in the NBA. And he's 2-time defending league MVP. So I bring these guys up to say, when have we seen not just Europe players being ranked, that highly, multiple in the NBA rankings or globally as players, right? We haven't. But why do I say the NBA should be ashamed of itself? Because the NBA is where you come to test your mettle. As I said, the NBA is where you come to show that you're one of the best in the world and to play against the best in the world. And when the Dream Team happened back in 92, wow, it's 30 years ago already. But anyway, when the Dream Team happened back in 92, the rest of the world was so far behind, but now they've caught up. And around that time, maybe even for the next 15 years or so, one of the things we saw was that no matter how good a European player, when they came here, they had to get used to 2 things, the speed and the physicality of the NBA game. So even the great ones, really, it took them a couple of years to get acclimated to the way the game is played in the NBA and to be able to shine and show their talents. You look at a guy like Toni Kukoc, who was one of the best European players ever, and at the time of the Dream Team was the best player in Europe. He was Luka Doncic before Luka Doncic. He comes over here and he has a heck of a time adjusting to the game. You saw a guy like Drazen Petrovic, who is, God bless the dead, he was a legend in Europe, and he comes over here and he was stuck on the bench behind Clyde Drexler in Portland before he got traded to New Jersey, and then really had an opportunity to shine before tragically dying young. There's a lot of guys. You look at guys like that and you say, wow, the NBA was so different then in terms, again, of its physicality, in terms of its rules, in terms of where the game was played. So there was a real adjustment period. Now you got guys like Luka coming over here and saying it's absolutely easier to score in the NBA. You got guys like Giannis breaking it down, saying how much tougher it is to play in Europe, and Jokic as well to play in the NBA. Should the NBA be proud of that? I don't think so, right? So what does this lead to? I've done a bunch of episodes on this channel where I talk about players today versus players in the past. I did an episode that was pretty popular for this channel, and Rick Barry was talking about the way the game is officiated today, the way the game is played today. And, you know, I've had arguments offline and online with tons of people who try to tell me that, you know, this player today and the way the game is played today is better and the players today are better, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, no, not necessarily. And the people who are arguing this with me, they're pointing at stats. And with that said, now let's go back to Luka saying it's much easier to score here today. Let's go back to Giannis and let's go back to Jokic, and these guys are saying, well, you know, the floor is more spread out, the paint is less packed, the 3-point line is the 3-point line is so much more prevalent. Guys are shooting so many more threes here. All these things are factors I brought up to talk about why it's so much easier to score today, why the game is the way it is today. We've got NBA Commissioner Adam Silver, who has come out and said, and I've had this on episodes as well, that the changes that they made in the game are having the desired effect. Okay, what does that mean? We know that the game is refereed, the game is coached, the game is played in a way so as to proliferate offensive production. We know that. At the end of the day, they are pushing it to try and score more points because why? That's more exciting. That's a sexier brand of basketball. It's not necessarily better, but it's more exciting for the average fan, right? Think about this. In every team sport, we've always heard what? Defense wins championships. Yet they want to legislate that out because it's not as exciting. It's not as good for gambling. And gambling is a big part of things, whether it's basketball, football, you know, whatever the sport is. All these team sports are trying to legislate out defense so that you can get more fan engagement due to higher scoring games. That necessarily doesn't make the game better. That doesn't make the players better. That just makes the numbers better. But that's only if you're looking at the numbers on their face and you're not really and truly evaluating the game and the player, right? If I look at a guy today who averages 30, let's say he averages 30 in the 2023 season, right? At the end of the day, averaging 30 in the NBA is not an easy thing to do. However, if I compare that to someone who averaged 30 in 1995 or 1992, is that the same 30? Absolutely not, because that player today who's averaging 30 might be taking 8 or 10 3-pointers per game, right? They might be attempting that. And meanwhile, in 1992 or 1995, the average team was shooting 10 3-pointers per game, not just one player. Most players, I'm really trying to think about it. I can't recollect any player, even the great shooters back then, who had the green light to shoot 10 threes in a game. They would get pulled by a coach, right? So also back then, you had much more physical defense. You had hand checking, you had forearm checking, you had packed paints, and I've talked about this. You had all-time elite shot blocking centers. You don't have that anymore. The game is so spread out now. It's an easy lane to the basket, right? You have very few elite shot blocking centers. Teams are shooting so many more threes. They're averaging 38 to 43-point attempts per game, because some math geek said that threes are better than twos, and if you shoot more threes, you'll win more games. Not necessarily the case, right? Everybody wants to be like the 7 seconds or less Suns or the championship Golden State Warriors. Everybody doesn't have those shooters and those tools, so just doing it that way doesn't necessarily make it more successful for you or make the math work out. If you don't have the shooters, you can shoot as many threes as you want. It's not going to work the same way. But anyway, getting back to the European players, right? There was never a time back then, and I know everything changes and quote unquote evolves. In some cases, things devolve, right? There's never been a time where you could have seen an NBA player, come from overseas and have the nerve to come into the league and say, it's easier to score here, or it's harder where I came from. Like, now with that said, Giannis did also say that the players here are more talented, so I don't want to be disingenuous. He did say that. But to say that it's harder over there, I think the NBA should be ashamed. And part of the reason that they did change it, right, try to legislate out defense. Look, you see a team like the 2004 Detroit Pistons, who beat that star-studded Lakers team in 5 games to win the championship. That season, those Pistons held 13 straight opponents under 75 points. That's insane. Now, if you truly appreciate gritty, hard-nosed basketball, if you appreciate defense in any sport, right? If you appreciate defense, you can marvel at how great that team was. But nobody today wants to see that, right? Because it's so much less exciting, right? But to me, That speaks to coaching, that speaks to scheme, that speaks to coachability of the players, that speaks to desire to do the little things that it takes to win. It might not be sexy, but guess what? Those guys are now immortalized because they got a championship out of it. Then you look at the following year was the Spurs, and 05 they went back to the finals. Pistons and the Spurs, 7-game series, and that was one of the lowest rated TV series ever. Why? Because the scoring was so low. And that's when really the shift started changing in terms of trying to make the game more offensive minded, trying to open things up. And then coincidentally, you see in like 06, you see Mike D'Antoni and the Suns just absolutely go crazy and totally blitz the league with their new style of play. But the point I'm trying to make is, at the end of the day, the NBA should be ashamed of itself that European players who have historically known, who have historically been known for being soft, can come to the league and really have the nerve to say that the game is much harder in Europe and it's easier to score here and it's easier here. So, what I want to know is, give me your thoughts and your feelings on this. Definitely leave me a comment in the comment section, and I'll get back to you next time. I'm out. Peace.